I think this is truly protectionism, not only a negotiating tactic. It's protectionism on a totally flawed basis. It is a decision essentially of one person. This is not a decision of the Republican Party. It's not coming from Congress. It's not a reflection of the business community. It's not a reflection of interest groups around the president. This seems, as best we can judge, to be a decision of President Trump. President Trump believes incorrectly that the trade deficits of the United States are a reflection of unfairness in the rest of the world, and that the trade deficits need to be closed. The trade deficits are not a measure of unfairness, either directly or indirectly. They're a measure of America's heavy spending compared to its income. And that reflects economically the large budget deficits in the United States more than anything else. We're running a budget deficit of about 7% of GDP. That means that the US government is borrowing heavily to transfer money to the private sector or to the domestic economy, and that leads to overspending. It's as if the federal government is the credit card of the country, and we're running up our credit card debt. So Trump interprets this as unfairness. He looks and says, well, if China's running a trade surplus, they're cheating us. This is extremely primitive thinking. And the question comes, how can the United States be in such a primitive political state of affairs that one person's ideas, especially mistaken ideas, apply? And that's a related question. My answer is that our political system has become deeply corrupted. Congress is mostly interested in campaign financing. And the system has become overtaken over decades by the security state. So legislation is littered with the emergency powers of the president, and Trump is invoking emergency powers to do his one person bidding on this. Now, if I add everything up, I would conclude by saying the policies make no sense. I don't think that they are primarily a bargaining chip. I think they're primarily the economic fantasies of one particular person. The fact that one person can do it is a massive political failure of the United States. It does not reflect the interests of American business, so American business may revolt. We're already hearing top business people objecting to what Trump is doing. This is something new, because they view Trump as their agent for further tax cuts. But they're wrecking the American economy, and Trump has destroyed $5 trillion of market capitalization in just 2 days. This does not make the hedge fund managers who bought Trump's election happier. This is something against their interests. Even some people in Congress are beginning to stir that, hey, we have a constitution. Tariffs are our responsibility, not the president's responsibility. We also have a court system in the United States which may very soon rule, when a case is brought, that these tariffs are illegal because they're based on an emergency declaration where there's no emergency. So Trump has made up an emergency in order to invoke emergency powers, and courts may strike that down as well. So all in all, very unpleasant, irrational actions that have been deeply destabilizing in just a few days for the world. They do not make sense. They are not for America first. This is a lose-lose policy.
Well, certainly stock markets around the world are reacting quite negatively to this. But how do you see wider global trade being impacted by this? For example, there's some kind of discussions now about a lot of Chinese exports possibly being directed to a large extent towards Europe. The Europeans then might react with some kind of tariffs of their own to protect their industries. Do you see this possibly spiraling out of control, triggering some wider global trade wars, or are you more optimistic?
That's a very good and very important question. Of course, a very uncertain prospect for all the reasons I just mentioned, that these policies may prove short-lived for one reason or another. But uh, the right answer for the rest of the world is to say we're going to move forward on open trade without the United States. So if rational minds prevail, they will say the United States has made an own goal, quite disastrous one, but it doesn't ruin the trade for the rest of us. But what you're proposing is a kind of domino effect where the U.S. Actions trigger shifts in trade that then lead to further unilateral protectionism. And if Europe were to raise barriers on China, we would have a cascade downward in the world economy. That is familiar in economic history, by the way, in the 1930s. It was a tariff measure in the United States, the Hawley-Smoot tariff, or the Smoot-Hawley tariff, depending on which congressman you put first, that was voted in 1930 that initiated a round of protectionist tariff increases all through the world in the early 1930s that led to a cataclysmic decline of trade that greatly exacerbated an underlying banking crisis that culminated in what was a prolonged Great Depression and the prelude to World War II. So, if one looks to history, the United States started the last such trade collapse with a tariff increase, that one voted by Congress. And the question is whether the same will happen now. I hope that Europeans are smarter than simply slapping on new tariffs. I hope that the Chinese and Europeans negotiate to understand Europe should export what it would have exported to the US now to China, and China can export what it would have exported to the US partly to Europe, partly to ASEAN, partly to India, partly to other countries. Some good news in recent weeks is that China, Japan, and Korea at the high diplomatic level have uh, intensified their diplomacy and called for more normalization of relations and reduction of tensions. Similarly, China and India have, in recent months, uh, at least addressed the border issues that have plagued the relationship. And leaders of both China and India have said that we need to move to strong relations among ourselves. Those are both good signs. But what you point to, the China Europe trade relations, is especially important.